Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Tiara International Friday Facebook Live. I'm Betsy Sobiek, and I'm here today with Elizabeth Rusky,
Hello.
Beth, and Peg Rowe.
Hi there.
And as usual, we are here on Friday afternoon in the Midwest region, at least, to talk about a leadership topic that feels like it's really relevant to our network, our clients, ourselves. It's usually always really relevant to ourselves. That's how we come up with these topics on Mondays. Liking these topics, make sure that you like our Facebook page or subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you are updated whenever one is either going live or the video is posted. Today's topic is boundaries, and we're going to talk about from a leadership perspective, whether you're leading your life, a community initiative in your family, or at work, a complex project, a team. What is the role of boundaries? And we find it a very interesting question because it feels like it's not just a simple answer. On one hand, as leaders, we get a lot of pressure to be flexible and open-minded and say yes and take input with others' ideas and go the extra mile and be a team player and all those cliches that we hear all the time. Yet we also hear the other side, which is make sure you're clear and don't be a doormat or taken advantage of. And you have to put yourself first and you have to draw your own boundaries and make sure you're taking care of your own well-being. And I know even personally, it's like, wait a minute, is this a time for a boundary? Is this time for me to be open and flexible?
Yeah.
And am I really tuned in to like what is important about both? And I feel like even for myself, there have been times when boundaries have been more important and times when openness has been more important. So we're just going to talk about it and see where this conversation goes. So boundaries. Beth, when you hear the topic of boundaries, what is it that comes to you first?
Well, first of all, I think you asked a great question. Like, you asked a lot of questions, but the one was like, is this the time for me to have a boundary? Is this the time for me to be flexible? I think that's a great question that everyone should get used to asking themselves, because we're responsible for our own boundaries. If we are not honoring them, then that's really up to us. And we can ask for help from others, of course. We can set them and make sure others know them. But it really does start, I think, boundaries for me anyway, with myself. I also think that a lot of women tend to, and I know it's a generalization, but women tend to be like Velcro. Things just stick to us. Yes, I'll do that. Yes, I'll add that to my list. Yes, I'll get that done. And we do. And we're really efficient and effective, at multitasking and doing a lot of things. But I think from a boundaries perspective, if we don't learn how to make the both and of putting us into the equation, then it will ultimately not work. It's a question of when.
Well, I'm struck by something which is going very basic with this. Like, what is a boundary? Does either of you have an example of like a boundary you drew or that someone drew, with you that felt like it really worked and ended up being a positive thing?
I'll throw one out. One of my sons moved back home, and he's going to go into school. So there's, trying to like respect each other's space. And one of the things when he moved back home, I'd asked him, I said, look, I would like us to have more of a roommate relationship than a parent-son, parent-child relationship. You're an adult, we're adults. So my boundary is I don't want to have to clean up after you. And when I make a request, I would like it really honored. Mm-hmm. So when I make a request around, cleanliness or keeping up with things. So that was very clear. We had good agreement on it. And there have been plenty of times over the last few months where I've had to actually make a subsequent request but to not say something, I would have been stepping over an agreement with myself, and it's something that I wanted. And to me, that's where the boundary, I started to feel the boundary or the zone of boundary.
Mm-hmm. Hey, what are you hearing in this?
Well, I would actually go back to sort of our initial part of the conversation and say that for me, boundary setting has been an evolutionary process and one that I will absolutely own that I don't do well all the time. I don't even think the idea of boundaries came into my awareness until probably way more recently. And so I definitely feel like I was in that group of people who, particularly women, for whom I felt like part of how I needed to prove my value was by saying yes and being a team player and doing what was asked of me. And what I know from that is that I had a tendency to kind of run myself into the ground when I did that. I was very dependable, very countable. No one was trying to overload me. But what I didn't do was make clear that I was at a point that I needed to make trade-offs. So I would still have sort of everything there on my list and think I needed to produce on everything. And again, no one was trying to like tear me down, take me down. But I, by saying yes to everything, really took on more than I could get done. And I didn't stop and ask the question, in order for you to do these 10 priorities, what's something that could drop to the bottom of the list? So I didn't take responsibility for managing all the things I had on my plate in an effective way. I just thought the only solution was for me to work harder, shoulder to the grindstone, get it done. And what we know now about what happens for women is that we're so busy in the doing, that we miss out on opportunities to be more influential, to be seen as more strategic, because we're really chasing the tactics all the time. And I definitely have that as a sort of a personal history and experience. And it's been, for me, it's still something I have to remind myself of. Mm-hmm. I still have to really think consciously about, is there a boundary that I need to set here? Or is this a time, to your point, Betsy, to remain open and to see what the possibilities are? So I think it's an interesting dance that we need to do. Because I don't think there's an absolute right or wrong answer. It's like it's unique for each of us. But I know I have to be way more tuned into what's the boundary and how do I observe that and what's the impact on me, and have I overcommitted? And in overcommitting, am I actually putting the results that I want to produce at risk because I've overcommitted?
Right. And so in both of what you're saying, I feel like a boundary is drawn when you say yes or no, or have an agreement to do or not to do something. Mm-hmm. Is a boundary always related to an agreement? Is it sometimes unrelated to an agreement? Like, can you draw a boundary without really going into the whole world of like yes, no, renegotiate an agreement?
I think you can. I think like people can, there was a conversation I had with someone last night that just in dialogue, I could tell that we had different perspectives on something, and a comment was made, and I thought it was derogatory, and it violated an invisible bound. Maybe not invisible. I'm kind of more vocal about that stuff now as I've gotten older, but like there was a boundary. I didn't even know this person, and so there was no agreement, but there was something for me that crossed the line, and I just said thank you and walked away. And that was, there was no agreement either way. And I didn't also make a big deal out of it either. It was like, okay. And I removed myself pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost like that was an unspoken boundary. Like you observed it for yourself, but didn't feel a need to create that clarity around it and make something of it, if you will.
Right.
Right. And I feel like as I'm listening to you too, I'm thinking that right now I'm at a client that is out of town. It's a manufacturing client. And I would say I have a boundary about, like, I don't really do a lot of socializing. I actually like everyone I work with quite a bit. And I'm totally open to doing some things that are more social when I'm in town over a weekend or whatever to a degree. But I actually know, like, I haven't said it out loud before, but I have kind of a professionalism boundary that I show up to, yes, relate to people and be supportive in lots of ways. But I've never been somebody with any of my corporate work or clients or jobs where I'm boundaryless around professional versus personal, which is not good, bad, right, or wrong. It's just something I'm noticing. Yeah. Tracks back a long time as a boundary. And I also know some people will have clear boundaries around health and well-being, like I need to go home by a certain time, or a workout or around family or around kids where they know like, okay, so this is the boundary. I can operate within this space in order to feel good. But I also feel like sometimes we don't know our boundaries until one's been crossed.
Yes.
Or until we've crossed one ourselves. You're like, whoa,
Right.
now I feel like I need to reset a boundary or something like that.
Yeah, I would say probably one of the things that I'm clear about for myself is that I don't always observe boundaries that in my mind I have for myself. I will cross over them in deference to what somebody else's needs are or somebody else's requests. And that's not always a bad thing. I mean, sometimes it's like, just be conscious of it and make a choice and be conscious of the choice. And other times I can recognize like, oh, I just literally ran right by that boundary and didn't give it a second thought, you know? And it's like, okay, well, that's interesting just to notice for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think sometimes there's this, like I might have a more, I don't know what the phrase is, but I might honor an external boundary, or to your point, Peg, you know, with somebody else more. I remember when my sons were younger and I had to be home at a certain time in order for the caregiver to leave, you know, so that was a boundary, you know, and if I didn't honor it, then I was scrambling for somebody else to honor it on my behalf. But I was clear, you know, and I think sometimes for me anyway, the boundaries I have with myself are the ones that get, they get violated more. And that's a pretty important, I think that word violated is a strong one, but that's what it starts to feel like when I've not put myself in the equation enough. It feels like a real violation. And I think the other thing it can do is I can get victimy. It's not pretty, but I can get victimy then, you know, because, oh, you know, I'm doing all this stuff, you know, and then you kind of like make other people wrong because you chose to do all that.
Right.
Right. So I feel like I'm also now hearing this thing about like boundaries are in different areas. So you had a time boundary when you had to get home at a certain time for your kids. You might have an energetic boundary if, you know, you're going, like, for example, I have an energetic boundary because I'm classically introverted. So I love people and I really like being out and about and connecting with a lot of people. But I know I have a boundary where at some point I just need to like draw a line and be alone for a little bit to recuperate. You may have like an agreement boundary, like a scope boundary of a project or an agreement or what you said you would do or not do. And then there's also these like personal boundaries, whether it's personal space, whether it's values, whether it's something else. So it feels like these boundaries may be in relationship to some of these multiple dynamics that we're navigating day in, day out. But then again, at the end, you said the thing about like what you said yes to and what you said no to. So it feels like saying yes and no are kind of like our boundary tools. is that
Yeah.
familiar? Like saying yeah, even if it's an internal, like yes, I am good to do this, or no, this is where I need to draw a boundary. That the yes and no seem to be how you kind of navigate your boundaries in certain scenarios.
Yeah, and I'm more aware that I am tuned into when I have a hesitancy about saying yes, where I didn't used to be. It used to be yes was kind of an automatic. And the growth for me has been being more tuned in, maybe still saying yes, but actually pausing for a moment to recognize if there's a hesitancy, what's that about? And am I still willing to say yes? Or is it a time to renegotiate and do something different? Where before, it literally was not something I would give a second thought to. I would just say yes automatically to Beth's point of, you know, requests came as, they were just like Velcro. They stuck to me and I felt like, it wasn't like persecution. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, I have to do this. It was just an automatic response.
Yeah.
Like that's what you do if you're a team player. That's what you do if you're contributing. And so it's taken a long time for me to even get to the place to push the pause button and stop for a moment and really think about it.
And it's probably a bit like a pendulum. Like if we've been in a place where it's like, yes, 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 or we've taken on a really big project, or we've been in a relationship where it feels like our boundaries have been sort of all over the place, that it may take kind of a swing back to the other side to be a little more rigid for a while. And then maybe there's a middle ground when someone's balanced of the flexibility and the no and the give and the take. Because I feel like when I am well rested and grounded. And even if I'm doing a lot and taking on a lot, I feel less like I have to be super rigid about my boundaries.
Mhm.
That if I am, like you were saying, Beth, in a place where I feel exhausted or taken advantage of or victimy, like something's happened, then I feel like, okay, I've got to be a little bit more rigid for a while. But when I'm in that kind of in that middle space, I
Right.
feel like it's a little more fluid.
Yeah.
I think Betsy, it's also confusing for people who live with me or know me well, because it kind of feels like, oh wait, all of a sudden there was a last straw and then she lost it. You know what I mean? That kind of
Yeah.
thing. And because I'm in that middle space a lot, I think it's like, whatever. Yeah, I can do it. I can. And all of a sudden you realize, or I realize, oh, I'm too far. I'm what's the phrase, Peg? I'm over my skis.
Yes.
I'm
Yeah.
over my skis.
For myself, the middle space isn't the saying yes to everything. So if I'm saying yes, if I find myself all of a sudden I'm tipping back, it's because I wasn't really in the middle space and tuned in. Like my middle space is kind of a balance of yes and no's every day.
Yeah.
So it feels like calibrated. And what I'd heard you just say is that it feels like you're in the middle space, but you're like, yeah. And then all of a sudden you're over your skis or something like that.
Yes and no. I think also, for at least for me, I mean, I can say no pretty clearly too. So I don't have a problem really saying no to things that I know aren't what I want to do or aren't going to fit. But it's the stuff, to Peg's point, if I, like if she didn't care or if she did care, it's when I don't pause and say, do I really care about this?
Mhm.
Then I feel like I'm a yeah, unless it's an obvious no. But I don't tend to be. I tend to be. I'm okay saying no.
Right. But it's the pause. So
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
feeling rested and in the middle zone, there's always the pause to choose
Right.
the yes or the no. And I
Yes.
think when there's no pause, that's when I sort of go down the slippery slope into feeling all of a sudden,
Agreed.
what did I get myself into? Or
Yeah.
rigid, like no. Like there's sometimes a pause
Yeah.
needed on that side too. But wait a minute, maybe I should.
Yeah.
I'd be curious from you both as to, kind of pushing a little further on when you find yourself being more rigid. Are there some triggers or are there some other things? For me, I'm recognizing that it might be around somebody not honoring their word or being in integrity, with what they said. So to the agreement point, I also sometimes find myself getting more rigid with certain people who are not managing their space, so they're like,
You may have like
constantly creating problems.
Yeah, I think we may each have like a strong boundary, and it's not necessarily in the thing of like a fluid boundary, but we each may have a strong boundary that's related to our value system. So if I value a particular thing, um, then if that value feels compromised, I know that I always have like a boundary around that. And I know for you, like keeping your word is like a high value for you. That's underlies trust and partnership and so many things you stand for. So whether you're balanced or not balanced or in an open-minded spot, you're going to have a strong boundary around keeping your word no matter what.
Yeah, I think that's really an interest. Thanks for pointing that out. I think,
Yeah.
the link to our values is really, I think that's true.
Mm-hmm. Right. And for me, like I was thinking of some of my values when you said that, like I know I have a value of peaceful coexistence. I have a value of adventure. I do have a value of like alignment, integrity from the thing of like things lining up. Like if someone says they do whatever. And so I may not have like a strong boundary in every situation with every person. Like you can be free to do your own thing or whatever. But if it's something I'm involved in, I know those are the things that I hold dear and people can also count on me for, that I don't personally waver on, that there needs to be a sense of exploration, freedom, and adventure. There needs to be a sense like the pieces are fitting together and it's purposeful. There needs to be a sense of like all people are heard, and I'm unwilling to compromise on some of those things unless I'm not, like other people can do what they want unless I'm involved. And then those are some things that I'm like, oh, well, this project or this friendship or this whatever has to have those components. So I think the values thing does apply to some of those consistent boundaries we have over time.
But I would also say for me that there are a couple of my values that would have me ignore my boundaries. So, for example, one of them around a real commitment to helping people develop, a real commitment to being, a listener for others, can have me actually ignore boundaries and devote so much time to that I'm recognizing like, oh, in my effort to be supportive and be of service, that I actually ignored other boundaries that are probably around my own well-being. So I think that our values and observing our values can actually work in either direction as it comes to acknowledging our boundaries.
And I think that a lot of times it's the constellation, because
Yes.
I'm not saying that this is for you, but someone may have a value of serving others, but they also may have a value of well-being at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of how you hold that work. I do want to say for people who are listening, either live to the recording, if you have a boundary practice or a reading or a resource or experience that you want to share, feel free to put it in the comments, either on Facebook or YouTube, because we always love new ideas, and we go back and check and see what comments have been added. And I know that the people who listen to these have a wealth of experience, and you may have another lens through which you work with boundaries that would be very helpful. So please comment and add there. And Peg, you asked a question as we were preparing that I thought was really interesting too, which was, how do we respect other people's boundaries? So the other thing that I know comes into play is that occasionally someone else draws a boundary that maybe we wish that they didn't draw, or it's not something that is in line with our values. So we may even feel like we don't respect it in some way, or it may feel like it's an obstacle to something we want to do. So when do you disrespect someone else's boundary? When do you challenge their boundary? How do I stay non-judgmental of a boundary? I'm sometimes envious. Like when someone has like really clear boundaries, I'm like, oh, look at that. That is fantastic.
That's awesome. boundary envy. Yes.
Exactly.
I think
there are other times where I'm like kind of about it as well.
I think sometimes for me what happens is I almost collide with someone else's boundary and don't realize it. It's almost like literally you go running right into it and it's like, oh, whoa, there's a boundary there and I didn't know that. And so for me, it's about being willing to recognize it when it's happening, call it out in a way that is positive towards a relationship versus judgmental or critical, but also really upping my.
We're still live on Facebook, so
okay. So it's really for me sort of upping my awareness and being willing to acknowledge it and not just keep going as if there isn't a boundary there. Yeah. And so being respectful of it, but doing it in a way that preserves the relationship as opposed to necessarily being in an argument with it. Now, it may be that in just acknowledging it, it opens up a possibility in a conversation for, renegotiating that boundary. But for me, I think I've tried to become much more aware of what is somebody else's boundaries that I might not have actually seen before and might have just, sort of walked by.
Right.
I think for us, inside of the leaders of Tiara, I think one of the things we do really well is try to push each other to honor our own boundaries. Mm-hmm. So it's not that I'm going to set them for any of you, or I'm asking you to set them for me, but I know we share them, or I'd like a boundary around this. And then we actually do ask each other for permission to help each other in that way. I think sometimes when we don't have that agreement, it can be tricky, because if I think somebody's making an agreement that doesn't feel win-win, like there's just, my intuition is saying, they're saying yes, and this doesn't feel right, I'll actually hit the pause button there too and just say, hey, wait a minute. You can say yes, no, you can renegotiate this, but, does this really work for you? And right. if they say yes at that point, I'm just going to trust what they say. I'm not going to badger somebody into it. But, it's also recognizing if, in this sense of, are they honoring their boundary? If you know it and you have permission to challenge them, of course. Right. But if you just sense something, I think, Peg, you're right. It's absolutely okay to test it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I know that the communications person that we work with will probably be viewing this, and she and I had a conversation before she left on vacation about what scope of things she would get done before her vacation or after. And I could hear her leaning into, well, and then I'll take my laptop, and if I don't get this quite done, and then and I was like, you know what? To your point, I'm like, I think maybe the boundary is like go on vacation and come back and create expectations on either side. And I feel like we do with our clients and ourselves and each other, try to help people when they're slipping into an old pattern of saying yes or taking on too much or breaching a boundary, to draw that clear boundary and live into it, because that's where ease and flow is. What happens when we say yes to something we don't really mean, and we breach a boundary, or we have two conflicting promises, right? So
Yes.
I promised my family I'd be 100% available on vacation. I promised my work people that I would do these 3 things. I promised myself that I would do X, Y, Z. And then all of a sudden, this intersection of all of these conflicting promises feels so intense. But if we're just like, wait a minute, what is the clear boundary here, the clear scope here, what I'm honoring here? That's the place of ease. Even if it's effort or hard work or something that is busy, there's an ease to it when the boundaries have been honored and clear, for sure. And then the other thing that I would say is when you do bump up, I like that visual of like when you bump up against someone else's boundaries and you may be surprised. The other thing we really practice is to not take it personally. Like in what we just talked about, that could be their value system. It could be they're coming off a bad situation and they're calibrating differently. It could be that they had a bad morning. Like, who knows what it is. When you bump against someone's boundary, you know, okay, so there's something happening. You can take a step back, you can pause, you can re-engage in a different way later, but it's not something that you have to take personally in any way. And I think that is a huge relief to know that it's not their boundary is not about you necessarily.
Yeah. Well, and I think it also goes to Beth's point of sometimes our boundaries shift differently. And so we may surprise them with a boundary in a moment that a week ago we wouldn't have had. Right. You know, so we have to be aware and be responsible that if we've shifted the boundary, that we may surprise other people. And, you know, it doesn't mean that it needs a whole lot of explanation or justification, but to recognize that we all of a sudden have put a boundary there that didn't exist a while ago, people are going to react to it in whatever way they're going to react.
Right. It's more like a river that gets narrow, gets big.
Yes. Yeah.
Not like it's just like always the same expectation.
Yeah.
And I think, Betsy, your point, you know, is really important, that people, you know, not to take it personally, because, you know, that a phrase I know we've heard it a long time ago was, they're not responding to you. Mm-hmm. So, you know, like whatever's happening in the middle, like in that instance, somebody's not responding to you. Mm-hmm. You know, they're responding to whatever's going on inside of them. Yeah. Now, you might have been the catalyst that provoked some of that, but it's not your fault. You don't have to take that on. That is a boundary you actually can know. Now, unless of course you were a jerk or something, but most of us aren't. So, you know, just because somebody had a reaction doesn't mean it's yours to take on either.
Right, right.
And I also like the point that you made. I was thinking about that earlier, Betsy, of the intersectionality of boundaries. It's like this unique boundary might be fine right now, and that unique boundary might be fine right now, and this one might be fine, but now if they all 3 exist together, now all of a sudden, yikes, there's too much. And so I think it is important for us to recognize that when all these agreements intersect, that we may have stepped over what we can actually do, and a new boundary has to get drawn at that point, because all of the yeses discreetly seemed fine, but now you put them all together, now it's a different deal.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think with all the work, being present, taking that, using your yes and no and communication and agreements, and just share with people around you where you are, to not take someone else's boundary personally. When someone does challenge you or cause you to create a boundary, again, that's not about them. It was a gift to you to be like, oh, I needed a boundary. I had no idea. Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
And all of that kind of thing. But it's more of a dance than it is like here are all my boundaries and I'm going to operate within them.
Yeah. I think it's a dance, and I think choice is a big, big, big piece of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Choice and communication.
Yeah.
Any other final words as we wrap up this one?
As always, I always love these conversations because they bring to the forefront things that I think are always in the background, but it's always nice to have a more conscious conversation around them because it increases my intentionality.
I would also say that we can set boundaries in a lot of different ways. We can be rigid, we can be dogmatic, we can be directive, we can also be graceful. And so when we're setting boundaries, be aware of how you're landing as you're setting the boundaries.
How you're landing for other people. Is what you're,
yeah.
So when you're setting a boundary, do it in a way that other people can hear it, can respect it, can move forward with it, etc. So it's not just like you in a vacuum setting boundaries, not being responsible for the effect it might have on the people near you, whether it's business or personal.
Yeah, I mean, you can say you can set a boundary and say the same phrase. You can say to someone, "This actually doesn't work for me," or you can be really ticked off and say it in such a loud way that now there's confrontation. But having the boundary and being clear on how you are actually coming across, it's the both and of putting yourself and the situation and the other people into the puzzle so that it does come out as a win-win, especially for you.
Great. Okay, so for those of you listening, again, if you like this kind of thing, like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Any comments are welcome below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, hear your insights, your frameworks, your resources on this topic and any others. And we will be back next Friday. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.